You open your eyes to the shimmer of turquoise waves lapping lazily against the golden sand, the air heavy with the scent of salt and the sweet perfume of cane blossoms swaying in the breeze. The twin islands of Saint Kitts and Nevis seem peaceful at first glance, like a tropical postcard frozen in time, but you soon sense that this beauty hides centuries of struggle. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world, like a family scattered but still connected. All right, let's ease into the story together. You walk along the shore where in the early 1600s the English planted their first settlement at Old Road Town on Saint Kitts, claiming the island as their Caribbean foothold. The French soon joined, setting up their own base, and for a while the two European powers shared the land uneasily until, of course, sharing became overrated and the clashes began. The islands, small as they are, held value beyond their size. Rich volcanic soil meant lush cane fields, and those cane fields translated into sugar, the white gold of the era. European demand for sugar turned this paradise into a battleground, with Britain and France fighting over ownership like toddlers quarreling over a toy. At one point, even the Spanish took an interest, swooping in briefly to rattle things further. You can almost hear the echo of cannons rumbling over the hills, a grim reminder that this idyllic place was for centuries a prize worth bleeding for. As you wander inland, the air grows thick with the ghosts of the plantations. Sugarcane stalks rustle under the sun, whispering stories of back-breaking labor. Enslaved Africans were shipped here by the thousands, torn from their homes and forced to toil under brutal conditions to satisfy Europe's sweet tooth. Their lives were marked by relentless work, the crack of the overseer's whip, and nights spent dreaming of freedom they might never touch. Yet amid the horror, resilience took root. You can almost sense it as you pass the ruins of an old estate, the unbreakable spirit of those who resisted, whether by fleeing into the mountains forming maroon communities or quietly defying their oppressors. Historians still argue whether these small acts of resistance played as large a role as open revolts in breaking the slave system, but one thing is clear: the human will to endure is stronger than chains. A quirky tidbit. The French, during one of their control periods, apparently introduced the practice of planting rows of tobacco before switching to sugar, thinking it would bring quick profits. Tobacco didn't thrive as they'd hoped, and sugar soon stole the spotlight. But the experiment left an odd historical footprint. You can still find wild tobacco plants sprouting here and there, like tiny survivors of an economic miscalculation. You pause to look at Brimstone Hill Fortress, its stone walls rising defiantly against the sky. This stronghold, built by enslaved labor under British command, became known as the Gibraltar of the West Indies. It withstood sieges and stood as a symbol of imperial power, a silent witness to centuries of conflict. The irony isn't lost on you. A fortress meant to secure British dominance was erected by the very people they subjugated. The structure today is eerily quiet, the cannons long silent. But as you trace your fingers along its weathered stones, you can almost hear the layered histories it guards. Life for the enslaved was brutally hard, yet culture survived in the cracks. You catch fragments of African rhythms in local music, taste their legacy in dishes cooked with spice and heart, and see their influence in the festivals that eventually blossomed from forbidden gatherings. These cultural threads woven into the island's fabric became quiet acts of defiance, proof that identity cannot be fully erased, no matter how much an empire tries. The colonial powers fought back and forth, treaties signed and broken like fragile promises. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 handed Saint Kitts fully to Britain, marking another shift in the chess game of empire. Under British rule, the islands became even more entrenched in the sugar economy, the plantations sprawling across the landscape like a net that caught everyone in its grip. By the late 18th century, Saint Kitts was one of Britain's most profitable colonies, but this wealth came at an unbearable cost to those who worked the fields. As night falls, you sit on the beach and watch the horizon glow faintly. The stars above seem unchanged, the same ones that enslaved Africans might have stared at after long days in the fields, perhaps wondering if freedom lay somewhere beyond them. The islands hold those memories quietly in the rustle of cane leaves and the soft crash of waves. You sense that the story of Saint Kitts and Nevis is not just about chains and suffering, but also about survival, resilience, and the long road toward self-determination. You wake to the low boom of distant surf, mingling with the faint cry of seabirds circling the cliffs. The early sun glints off the Caribbean waters, but the morning peace hides an era when these same waters churned with sails and gunpowder. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Saint Kitts and Nevis became a glittering pawn in the rivalry between two European giants, Britain and France. You walk up a hill where cannons once pointed toward the sea, and you can almost see the silhouettes of ships on the horizon, their masts swaying like a forest of spears. The islands were small but strategically placed. Controlling them meant controlling trade routes, and both empires wanted the upper hand. The first major clash you sense is the bloody massacre of Kalinago people in 1626, when the English and French settlers turned on their indigenous allies. It was a ruthless act that cleared the way for plantation expansion, though it also left the land steeped in sorrow. The Kalinago spirit lingers in the wind that whistles through the trees, as if reminding you that colonial history began with betrayal. By the late 1600s, the Caribbean had become a theatre of war, with Saint Kitts as a main stage. Battles raged, alliances shifted, and treaties were signed in European halls, far from the islands themselves, where the people most affected had no voice. You might chuckle darkly at how often the same land changed hands. One French invasion here, a British recapture there. It was like an endless tennis match played with cannonballs. Brimstone Hill Fortress, which you saw yesterday, became the key defensive jewel. When the French laid siege to it in 1782, British troops held out for weeks until they finally surrendered. A year later, under the Treaty of Paris, Britain got the island back anyway. Historians still argue whether this back and forth strengthened British resolve or simply highlighted the absurdity of imperial wars where civilians bore the real cost. The fortress, with its high walls and panoramic views, now welcomes tourists, but it once stood as a tense outpost where soldiers scanned the horizon for sails that meant life or death. A quirky moment floats to you from 1706, when a French attack on Nevis ended with settlers hiding their valuables in barrels and tossing them into the sea to keep them from being looted. Legend says some barrels were never recovered, sparking treasure hunts even centuries later. You half wonder if some lucky swimmer might still bump into a gold-filled barrel while snorkeling, though chances are slim unless you're very, very lucky. The sugar industry made these islands sparkle with wealth, at least for the British elite. Planters built grand houses while enslaved Africans bent over the cane in blistering heat. You tread through the remains of an old sugar mill, the gears frozen in time, and you picture workers feeding stalks into its maw. The air would have been thick with the sweet and bitter smell of boiling cane juice and the smoke of furnaces. For the British, every shipment of sugar was profit. For the enslaved, it was another day under the sun's merciless glare. You notice the irony. While Britain and France fought to claim the islands, the majority of the population, those who did the work, had no freedom to claim at all. Rebellions simmered quietly, escape attempts were punished harshly. Yet the enslaved found ways to fight back through sabotage, secret gatherings, and the preservation of their cultural practices. Each drumbeat, each whispered song was a spark of resistance, even when open revolt was too dangerous. As the 18th century closed, global events shook the islands. The Haitian Revolution in the 1790s sent ripples of fear through colonial administrators across the Caribbean, including here. The idea that enslaved people could rise, fight, and win independence was terrifying to those in power and inspiring to those in chains. Britain tightened control, but the seed of freedom was already planted. The Napoleonic Wars added another layer of chaos, with French attempts to reclaim territories and British determination to hold them. Through it all, Saint Kitts remained under British rule, a jewel in their Caribbean crown, though one that burned with the heat of unrest. You stroll down to the harbour where ships once unloaded goods, and human cargo alike, and the air seems to hold echoes of languages from across the Atlantic. This was a hub not just for trade, but for cultural collision, European ambition, African resilience and indigenous memory mixing in ways that would shape the island's identity. You realize that even in times of war, life continued. Children played in village yards, fishermen cast nets at dawn, and families found joy in small moments, despite the shadow of empire. The islands might have seemed powerless to the outsiders who decided their fate in distant capitals, but you feel the quiet strength that endured. Empires came and went, treaties were signed and torn, yet Saint Kitts and Nevis remained holding its culture close, waiting for the day when it could finally step out of the shadow. You wake again to the sound of drums faintly echoing through the hills, as if carried from a memory. The air feels heavier now, not with the salt of the sea, but with the weight of lives once shackled to the soil. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, slavery was the grim backbone of Saint Kitts and Nevis. You step into a clearing where sugarcane still grows tall, its blades swaying lazily, and you can almost see the lines of enslaved workers cutting cane under the punishing sun. The fields seem to whisper the names of those who worked them, names mostly lost to history. The British Empire treated these people as property, their humanity erased by ledgers and profit margins. Days were long, nights were short, and punishment was severe for the smallest act of defiance. Overseers patrolled with whips ready, and the law was stacked against those who dared to resist. Yet you notice a spark in every shadow. Even in the harshest conditions, enslaved Africans found ways to hold on to their identity, secretly singing, passing down stories, and practicing elements of their culture when they thought no one was watching. Those rhythms you heard earlier, they're the same rhythms that once rose from hidden gatherings, pulsing with hope. Historians still argue whether revolts on these islands were as frequent or as large as in places like Jamaica or Haiti. Some suggest that Saint Kitts in smaller size made escape harder and uprisings riskier. Yet there were acts of resistance, burned fields, broken tools, and the occasional open rebellion that was quickly crushed but never fully silenced. You can almost picture an overseer waking to the sight of smouldering cane, wondering which worker had dared to strike back. That act, small as it was, whispered louder than chains. One quirky story tells of a group of enslaved people who used the cover of carnival festivities to plan escapes and secret meetings. Colonial authorities eventually cracked down on the gatherings, but not before the tradition had taken root. Over time, those forbidden festivities evolved into today's vibrant carnival celebrations where music and dance fill the streets. What began as a mask for rebellion became a lasting cultural treasure. In 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade, but not slavery itself. Ships stopped bringing new captives, yet those already enslaved remained bound to the plantations. You stand near an old jetty where ships once docked, and you can almost see the ghostly outlines of vessels that no longer came, their human cargo replaced by the hum of local life. For the enslaved, the end of the trade brought little comfort. The chains were still there. It wasn't until 1834 that Britain abolished slavery across its empire, and even then freedom came with strings attached. You watch a scene unfold in your mind, newly emancipated workers celebrating their liberty, only to be told they must serve an apprenticeship period working for their former masters under slightly less brutal conditions. Freedom, it turned out, was not as free as they'd hoped. This apprenticeship lasted until 1838, when true emancipation was finally declared. The joy of that day must have been indescribable, yet the reality of life after slavery was complicated. You wander through a village that grew from those post-emancipation years, small houses clustered together, gardens blooming with cassava and breadfruit. Freed men and women tried to carve out lives for themselves, buying plots of land when they could, building communities where they were once forbidden to own anything. Yet plantation owners still held economic power, and many freed workers had little choice but to continue laboring in the cane fields, this time for wages so low they barely survived. The chains were gone, but the shadow remained. The British tried to keep control with laws that favoured the planters, ensuring that the island's economy still served the empire. Yet the former enslaved population slowly pushed back, forming villages, churches and schools, strengthening their communities. Education became a quiet act of rebellion, a way to claim a future that no master could take away. You picture children walking barefoot to a small schoolhouse, their faces bright with curiosity, and you can't help but smile at the thought of knowledge as a weapon sharper than any sword. By the mid-19th century, the global sugar market began to shift. Other countries started producing sugar, prices fell, and the Caribbean plantations struggled. You might think this would weaken the planters' hold, but it also made life harder for workers who depended on the industry. Economic hardship pushed many to seek work abroad, some travelling to other British colonies in search of better opportunities. The island's population became more mobile, and with that movement came new ideas, new perspectives, and a slow-growing awareness that their destiny didn't have to be dictated from London. As evening settles, you sit on a stone wall overlooking the sea, and the horizon glows with the last traces of sunlight. You think of all those who endured slavery, who resisted in ways big and small, and who laid the foundation for the freedom their descendants would one day fully claim. The journey to independence still seemed far off, but the first steps, hard, painful steps, had already been taken. The night passes, and you find yourself wandering a path lined with the remnants of old estate walls, their stones cracked and swallowed by vines. By now the chains of slavery have been legally broken, but as you move through the mid-19th century into the early 20th, you notice something unsettling. The freedom won on paper doesn't quite match the freedom lived. You step into the shoes of those newly emancipated, trying to navigate a society still structured to keep them at the bottom. You wander through a marketplace in Basseterre, where former slaves sell yams, coconuts, and woven baskets. Their voices rise above the hum of trade, but beneath the energy there's a quiet frustration. Plantation owners still hold the best land, and the British colonial administration continues to favour their interests. Most freed families must rent small plots or return to the cane fields as wage labourers, where their pay barely covers survival. The so-called New Freedom is just another version of dependency. Historians still argue whether emancipation truly transformed society or simply replaced one set of shackles with another. The 19th century grinds on, and the sugar industry, the island's lifeblood, begins to falter. Beet sugar rises in Europe, cutting into profits from Caribbean cane. You watch as estates fall into disrepair, their machinery rusting, their owners moving to England or selling land. For workers, the decline brings no relief. It just means fewer jobs and lower wages. Yet there's a strange resilience in the air. Freed families rely more on their own small gardens, grow their own food, and trade with each other rather than depending solely on the plantations. In their quiet determination, you sense the beginnings of a shift. A quirky detail sticks out as you pass an old Anglican church. During this period, the church played a complicated role. Missionaries set up schools and preached education as the path to salvation, but they also preached obedience to colonial authority. Many locals took the education and politely ignored the obedience part. Over time, these schools produced teachers, clerks, and leaders who would later challenge the very system that taught them to submit. You can't help but smile at the irony. The colonial church, without meaning to, was raising the next generation of freedom seekers. By the early 20th century, the island's economy remained tied to sugar, but other currents began to stir. Workers started forming trade unions, quietly demanding better pay and conditions. You picture a group of men gathering under a breadfruit tree, their voices low as they discuss organizing a strike. British officials dismissed these early unions as nuisances, but they underestimated how much pressure was building beneath the surface. You step into the streets during the 1930s and feel the air crackle with tension. The global Great Depression hit Saint Kitts and Nevis, hard, driving unemployment and poverty to extremes. Workers go on strike, demanding fair wages and better treatment. These labor movements ripple across the Caribbean, connecting the islands in shared struggle. On St. Kitts, protests lead to clashes with colonial police, and leaders like Thomas Manchester and Joseph France emerge, speaking boldly against injustice. These voices rising from the working class begin to shape politics in ways the British can no longer ignore. Meanwhile, Nevis, the smaller of the two islands, begins to grumble louder. Its residents feel neglected by the administration, based on Saint Kitts claiming their needs are ignored while resources are funneled toward the larger island. This resentment simmers quietly, setting the stage for future tensions. You pass through Charlestown, Nevis's capital, and hear townsfolk voicing their frustrations. We are not just an appendage to Saint Kitts. It's a reminder that the road to independence won't just be a battle against colonial power, but also about balancing the relationship between the two islands themselves. By the time World War II breaks out, the islands, though far from the European battlefields, are drawn into the global conflict. Britain tightens its grip, yet the war also exposes cracks in the colonial order. West Indians serve in the armed forces, travel abroad, and return with broadened horizons. They've seen a world where the British are not invincible, and they've tasted the idea that equality is not an impossible dream. The post-war years bring new energy to the independence movements sweeping across the Caribbean. You take a final look at the sugar fields in the fading light. They still stand tall, but they no longer hold the same power. The people working them now do so with wages, however small, and with voices growing louder by the day. A quiet revolution is underway, not of guns, but of words, strikes and ballots. The islands may still be under Britain's wing, but you can sense that wing growing weaker, its feathers thinning as the people beneath it find their own strength. As the night deepens, you realize that emancipation was just the opening act. The true performance, the fight for political power and full independence, was only beginning to take the stage. The air feels charged, as if the islands themselves are preparing to shake off the last remnants of the chains that once bound them. You awake to the buzz of a humid afternoon, the sky overcast with clouds that hang low, as if waiting for something to break. It's the mid-20th century now, and the winds of change sweep across the Caribbean like an approaching storm. You find yourself in a meeting hall in Basseterre where local leaders, union members and community figures debate passionately. The room smells of sweatwood and determination. It is here that talk of self-rule begins to take shape, yet in whispers rather than shouts. After World War II, the British Empire weakened, struggling to maintain its far-flung colonies. Across the Caribbean, new ideas take root, ideas of autonomy, federation and independence. You hear the name of a plan floating around: the West Indies Federation, a bold experiment to unite several British Caribbean colonies into a single political entity. Historians still argue whether this federation was ever meant to succeed, or if Britain pushed it mainly to make its decolonization process more manageable. Regardless, in 1958, Saint Kitts, Nevis and Anguilla joined the federation, stepping into something both promising and fragile. At first, the Federation feels like a breath of fresh air, a chance for the islands to work together and strengthen their collective voice. Leaders speak of a shared Caribbean identity, envisioning a united future where small territories can stand tall together. You can almost hear the excitement in the speeches, the hope in the crowds. Yet beneath the optimism, cracks quickly form. Differences in size, resources and political ambition stir resentment among members. Jamaica, the largest and most influential partner, dominates decisions, while smaller territories like Saint Kitts and Nevis feel overshadowed. You wander through the streets and overhear murmurs. What's the point if we're just trading one master for another? On Nevis, the feeling of being overlooked intensifies. Residents see their island's concerns swallowed by the larger interests of Saint Kitts, and by extension, the Federation. It's an early taste of the tensions that will later define the relationship between the two islands. A quirky detail emerges from this time in casual conversations. Some Nevisians jokingly referred to themselves as a country within a colony within a federation, a tongue twister of layered dependencies that says more than any speech could. The West Indies Federation limps along for only 4 years. By 1962, Jamaica withdraws, unwilling to play second fiddle, and Trinidad follows shortly after. Without its largest members, the Federation collapses like a house of cards in the wind. You stand on a pier watching a ship leave harbour, symbolizing the Federation's short-lived dream, sailing away into history. For the people of Saint Kitts and Nevis, the collapse is both a disappointment and a wake-up call. Unity is fragile, and the road to independence will need to be walked carefully, perhaps alone. In the aftermath, Britain reorganizes its Caribbean territories into smaller associated states. Under this new arrangement, Saint Kitts and Nevis Anguilla gains more self-government while Britain retains control over defense and foreign affairs. You step into the legislative building where local politicians now have greater authority to make domestic decisions. It's a step forward, but not the final step. Power still flows through London, and the taste of full sovereignty remains out of reach. Meanwhile, tensions rise in Anguilla, the third member of this tri-island unit. Anguillians, feeling neglected by Basseterre, rebel in 1967, expelling Saint Kitts police and effectively breaking away. You watch as British troops land on Anguilla in 1969, not to crush independence, but to restore order under British oversight. The Anguilla issue drags on, highlighting the cracks in this union. Eventually, in 1980, Britain formally separates Anguilla from Saint Kitts and Nevis, leaving the latter two islands as a pair. You can almost hear Nevisians saying, if Anguilla could break away, why can't we? This question will echo for decades. A mainstream fact stands out in 1967 under the new status as an associated state. Robert Bradshaw, a former trade union leader turned politician, becomes chief minister. His government pushes for more autonomy, strengthening local control, and his charisma inspires many. Yet his policies sometimes deepen Nevis's feelings of marginalization, as development projects seem to favor Saint Kitts. The seeds of internal division grow even as the islands edge closer to self-rule. As the 1970s unfold, the Caribbean is alive with independence movements. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados and others break from Britain one by one, like dominoes toppling in slow motion. You can sense the envy and inspiration in the air over Saint Kitts and Nevis. The question is no longer if independence will come, but when and how. You stand on the coastline at sunset, watching the horizon glow orange and red. The waves seem to carry voices from other islands that have already claimed their sovereignty. The people here hear them too, and their hearts beat faster at the thought of joining that chorus. The era of waiting is ending, and the time to act is drawing near. The experiment of federation may have failed, but the desire for independence burns stronger than ever. You open your eyes to the humid heat of the 1970s, where the sun beats relentlessly against rooftops in Basseterre and Charlestown alike. The Federation is long gone. Anguilla has slipped away into British hands, and now Saint Kitts and Nevis are left staring at each other across the narrow channel, bound together, yet uneasy in their union. The air is thick with political debate, and you can almost hear the sound of typewriters clacking as new proposals, petitions and policies fill government offices. The breakup of the West Indies Federation has forced Saint Kitts and Nevis to define themselves anew. Under the associated statehood granted in 1967, the islands have more control than ever before, but Britain still holds the reins on defence and international affairs. You walk into a legislative session where Chief Minister Robert Bradshaw delivers fiery speeches about self-determination. He envisions a strong Saint Kitts and Nevis rising together as an independent Caribbean nation. His words ignite some hearts, yet they also stir discomfort on Nevis, where many feel his centralizing policies ignore their needs. The idea of independence excites Saint Kitts, but on Nevis it sparks quiet suspicion. As you stroll through Charlestown, you hear voices muttering under the shade of tamarind trees. Bradshaw spends everything in Basseterre. Nevis gets crumbs. The islanders feel their autonomy slipping, and whispers of secession grow louder. Historians still argue whether Bradshaw's focus on developing Saint Kitts was driven by practicality or favoritism, but the effect on Nevisian sentiment was undeniable. You catch sight of an old ferry crossing the channel, a simple boat carrying workers and traders, yet symbolically it's a lifeline between two islands growing apart. A quirky tidbit surfaces during these years. Nevisians sometimes jokingly referred to their island as the Forgotten Sister, despite its rich history and natural beauty. Tourists loved Nevis for its quiet charm, but locals worried about being overshadowed in every political decision. Even the lush slopes of Nevis Peak seemed to brood silently, cloaked in clouds. After Bradshaw's death in 1978, leadership passes to Paul Southwell and then to Sir Kennedy Simmons, a young doctor-turned-politician who heads the People's Action Movement. Under Simmons, the push for independence accelerates. Negotiations with Britain intensify and talk of breaking the colonial tie fills public meetings. You picture crowds gathering in Basseterre, some cheering the prospect of independence, others worried about whether the islands are ready to stand on their own. Meanwhile, Nevis begins to demand stronger guarantees that its interests will not be trampled in an independent state. You step into a meeting in Charlestown where community leaders argue passionately for constitutional safeguards. They call for the right to manage their own local affairs and even insist on a clause allowing Nevis to secede if necessary. This demand may sound extreme, but it reflects the island's deep desire for respect and self-determination. In 1980, a pivotal moment arrives. Britain formally separates Anguilla, leaving Saint Kitts and Nevis as the only two islands in the associated state. This restructuring forces the government to draft a new constitutional arrangement. You watch as legal minds hunch over documents debating every line. The final version will include an extraordinary feature, Article 113, granting Nevis the legal right to hold a referendum on independence if it ever wishes to leave the Union. This clause, unique in the Caribbean, will become both a safeguard and a lingering reminder of the island's fragile bond. As the 1980s dawn, the independence movement gains momentum. The Caribbean is alive with examples. Dominica breaks from Britain in 1978, St. Lucia in 1979, St. Vincent and the Grenadines that same year, and Antigua and Barbuda in 1981. St. Kitts and Nevis feel the pull of history. One by one, their neighbours have stepped onto the world stage as sovereign nations. The pressure to join them builds. One night you stand at the Basseterre harbour, the salty breeze carrying the scent of rum and the distant sound of calypso. You imagine the conversations in homes across both islands, fathers weighing the risks, mothers dreaming of better futures for their children, elders recalling the chains of colonial days and urging that they never return. The stars shimmer above, indifferent yet eternal witnesses to humanity's struggles and triumphs. Historians still debate whether the British encouraged independence to cut costs or genuinely supported self-rule. Whatever their motives, negotiations move forward, and the people of St. Kitts and Nevis prepare for the leap. The road has been long marked by slavery federation failures and internal tensions, but the islands stand at the threshold of history. You can almost feel the ground vibrating with anticipation, as if the very soil knows something monumental is about to happen. The stage is set. Britain is ready to let go. St. Kitts is eager to lead, and Nevis, cautious but determined, seeks to secure its voice in whatever comes next. The tropical night hums with the sounds of crickets and distant waves, but beneath the calm lies the electricity of a people on the edge of freedom. The first light of dawn creeps over the Caribbean horizon, casting the sea in shades of silver and pink. You rise with it, stepping into the early 1980s, a time when politics on St. Kitts and Nevis are pulsing with urgency. The air feels alive with change. Flags flutter in the breeze, and posters bearing the faces of local leaders decorate the streets. The British Union. Jack still flies above official buildings, but you can sense it is nearing the end of its watch. Kennedy Simmons, now Premier, becomes the face of the independence drive. A man with the calm authority of a physician, he has spent years treating both patients and the political wounds of his people. Under his leadership, negotiations with Britain intensify. You can almost hear his voice in closed-door talks, firm but measured, demanding full sovereignty. The British, facing a declining empire, are more willing than in earlier decades to loosen their grip. Yet they also insist on conditions, stability, constitutional protections, and assurances that the new nation will not fall into chaos. On Nevis, the mood is mixed. Many residents remain wary, fearing that independence could simply replace one distant authority with a closer, more controlling one from St. Kitts. At community meetings in Charlestown, speakers stand on makeshift platforms urging guarantees that Nevis will not be sidelined. The Nevis Reformation Party (NRP), led by Simeon Daniel, voices these concerns loudly, demanding strong autonomy for the smaller island. You walk among the crowd feeling the tension, crackle pride in a shared history, but also anxiety about a shared future. One mainstream fact stands out: the negotiations produce a constitution with a unique federal structure. Nevis gains its own island administration, complete with a local assembly and premier. Most notably, Article 113 gives Nevis the right to secede from the Federation if 2/3 of its voters agree in a referendum. This provision is rare, almost unheard of in small nations, and it speaks volumes about the careful balance required to hold the Union together. Historians still argue whether including this clause was a stroke of political genius or an admission that the Federation was fragile from birth. Amid the heavy debates, life on the islands continues. You stroll through the streets of Basseterre, where market vendors sell fresh fish and mangoes, laughter drifts from shopfronts, and children run barefoot across sunlit squares. Politics may stir the adults, but the rhythms of daily life keep moving. You realize independence isn't just about leaders and constitutions, it's about ordinary people hoping for better schools, better jobs, and a stronger voice in their destiny. A quirky memory from this period involves a campaign rally where a local band played calypso songs with lyrics poking fun at politicians. The crowd laughed and danced even as they debated serious issues. Caribbean politics, you realize, always carries a touch of music, humor, and resilience. Even in the heaviest moments, there's a beat that keeps everyone moving forward. The talks with Britain edge closer to success. The British government agrees to a timetable for independence, with both islands preparing to take full control of their affairs. You imagine British officials packing their papers, clearing their desks, and shaking hands with local leaders who now stand ready to govern their homeland. Yet you also sense Britain's lingering presence. Colonial ties do not vanish overnight, and economic dependence remains a challenge. As the final months before independence pass, Nevisians continue to voice their concerns. Simeon Daniel ensures the new arrangement will give Nevis substantial self-governing powers, including control over health, education, and local infrastructure. These safeguards calm some fears, but whispers of potential secession never fully fade. You stand on the Charlestown Pier at sunset, listening to conversations drifting from the nearby bar. We'll give independence a chance, but if they forget us, we have our claws. The eve of independence approaches and celebrations begin to stir. School children practice new songs, artisans craft flags, and the islands hum with expectation. You can feel the mix of pride and nervousness in every handshake, every smile. The people know they are stepping into uncharted waters, but they would rather sail their own boat, even through storms, than ride forever as passengers under another flag. The night before independence, you stand on a quiet hilltop, looking down at the lights of Basseterre, twinkling like stars scattered across the earth. The air is still almost holding its breath. For over 3 centuries, these islands have lived under foreign rule, first Spanish threats, then French ambitions, and finally the long British shadow. Now that shadow is lifting. The road has been long filled with battles, labor struggles, and political debates, but the destination is finally within reach. When the first light of morning touches the land again, it will shine on a people ready to claim their own name on the world stage. The countdown to independence has begun, and the islands of Saint Kitts and Nevis stand poised at history's threshold, hearts beating with the promise of freedom. The morning of September 19th, 1983 dawns bright and warm, as if the sky itself approves of what is about to unfold. You find yourself standing among a growing crowd in Basseterre, where anticipation buzzes like electricity in the air. Flags flutter in the sunlight, new flags, their green, yellow, black, red and white, gleaming fresh against the blue sky. The smell of roasted corn and fried fish drifts from vendors, mingling with the sound of steel drums and calypso rhythms. Children wave small flags, their voices rising in excited chatter. The streets have never felt so alive. For years, Saint Kitts and Nevis have prepared for this day. Negotiations with Britain have ended in agreement, the constitutional safeguards are in place, and at last the moment has come to declare independence. You stand shoulder to shoulder with islanders who have lived through colonial rule, through strikes, protests, and political battles. Their faces glow with pride, some wet with tears they don't bother to hide. A new chapter is about to begin. The ceremony takes place in Independence Square, once site of slave auctions and colonial power, now transformed into a stage for liberation. The irony isn't lost on you. Where chains once clinked, a new flag will rise. Premier Kennedy Simmons steps forward to address the crowd. His voice carries over the square firm and clear, thanking those who fought, those who dreamed, and those who never lived to see this day. As he speaks, you sense the weight of history on his shoulders, but also the lightness of a dream fulfilled. Historians still argue whether Britain's departure was primarily a concession to local demands or a pragmatic withdrawal from costly responsibilities. The debate doesn't matter to the cheering crowd. What matters is that the Union's jack will soon be lowered for the last time. The flag flutters slowly down the pole, its movement almost reluctant, as if it too knows an era is ending. Then, with a triumphant swell of music, the new flag of Saint Kitts and Nevis rises. Green for fertile land, yellow for sunshine, black for the African heritage of its people, red for the struggle for freedom, and white stars for the two islands' equal partners in this new federation. The cheers erupt so loudly you can feel them vibrate through the ground. Nevisian representatives stand proudly, though their expressions are more reserved. They celebrate, yes, but they also watch carefully, reminding everyone that their voice must not be forgotten. Premier Simeon Daniel ensures Nevis's autonomy is recognized, his calm demeanor belying the fierce protection he holds for his island's rights. You overhear someone whisper, "We are one nation, but two hearts," and the phrase sticks with you. A quirky moment breaks the solemnity. A group of children, too impatient to wait for the official parade, starts marching with tiny homemade drums, their rhythm uneven but joyful. The crowd laughs, and for a moment the seriousness of politics melts into the simple happiness of being free. It's in these small, unscripted moments that you see the soul of independence. As the celebrations continue, you walk through the streets where music spills from every corner. Steel pans sing, dancers twirl, and food vendors hand out plates piled high with goat water, johnny cakes, and fresh tropical fruit. Fireworks crackle against the evening sky, their colors reflected in the sea. From the pier, you watch the lights shimmer on the water and think of all the ships that once sailed here under foreign flags. Tonight, the harbor belongs to the islands themselves. The day is filled with pride, but as night falls, quiet conversations reveal the challenges ahead. Independence is not a magic wand. The economy still leans heavily on sugar tourism and foreign aid. There are debts to manage, alliances to forge, and internal tensions to navigate. You hear someone at a bar say, "We've climbed the hill, but the mountain's still ahead." Yet the tone is hopeful rather than fearful. The people believe they can meet those challenges because for the first time the choices are theirs to make. Nevis's clause to secede remains an undercurrent, a reminder that unity must be nurtured, not assumed. But on this night, under the glow of fireworks, it doesn't feel like a threat. It feels like a promise that both islands will respect each other in this new partnership. The stars above shine bright, mirroring the two white stars on the flag below. As the festivities wind down, you step back into Independence Square, now quiet under the moonlight. The new flag flutters gently in the night breeze, its colors glowing faintly in the lamplight. You stand there, letting the moment sink in. After centuries of colonial rule after slavery, resistance, failed federations, and tense negotiations, Saint Kitts and Nevis now stand as a sovereign nation. The journey has been long and difficult, but the destination has finally been reached. You take a deep breath of the warm night air, feeling the history that swirls around you. The chains have been broken, the voices have been heard, and the islands have stepped onto the world stage under their own name. Independence isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new one. The days following independence hum with the afterglow of celebration, but soon the reality of governing a new nation settles in. You walk through the streets of Basseterre, now adorned with fresh flags on government buildings, and sense both pride and caution in the air. Saint Kitts and Nevis have their freedom, but the questions of how to manage it and how to thrive without Britain's safety net weigh heavily on everyone's mind. Kennedy Simmons, now Prime Minister, faces the delicate task of building a stable economy. Sugar, once the island's lifeblood, is no longer the reliable golden crop it once was. Global prices have fallen and foreign competition is fierce. You watch as policymakers debate strategies diversify the economy, boost tourism, attract foreign investment. The islands begin marketing themselves as an untouched paradise, inviting travelers to enjoy white sand beaches and historic sites. Hotels rise along the coastline and cruise ships dock with increasing frequency. Tourism starts to grow, but so does the concern about overdependence on an industry that can be as fickle as the weather. On Nevis, development moves more slowly. While Saint Kitts builds infrastructure and courts investors, Nevis focuses on maintaining its tranquil charm, attracting a more selective type of tourism, quieter upscale, and tied to its identity as a less developed escape. This difference in pace fuels old tensions. Nevisians continue to ask, are we equal partners or just the small island tagging along? Simeon Daniel and his Nevis Reformation Party ensure that the local assembly uses its autonomy to control development on the island. You attend a session where they fiercely debate land use policies, their voices passionate and unapologetic. A quirky tidbit emerges from the early years of independence. Nevis introduced its own island flag, alongside the national flag, a quiet but bold assertion of identity. While both flags fly together, the message is clear: Nevis remembers its distinct voice and will not let it fade. In 1998, the tension rises to a dramatic point. You find yourself amid heated rallies as Nevis holds a referendum on whether to secede and form its own independent state. The islanders gather in town squares, waving banners, chanting slogans, and debating late into the night. Historians still argue whether the referendum reflected genuine dissatisfaction or simply Nevis's desire to test its leverage within the Federation. The vote results fall just short of the two-thirds majority required for secession. Over 60% say yes, but it's not enough to meet the constitutional threshold. The result is a mixture of relief and frustration, a reminder that the Union remains intact but fragile. Despite this close call, the Federation survives. Leaders on both islands begin to work harder to address the inequalities that fueled Nevis's secession movement. Federal funds are directed more evenly and dialogue improves, though the relationship remains one of careful balance. You watch as both islands continue to negotiate their partnership, a dance of autonomy and unity, where neither wants to step too hard on the other's toes. Meanwhile, Saint Kitts and Nevis start to make their mark internationally. As one of the smallest countries in the world, they join organizations like the United Nations and the Commonwealth, proudly taking their seat at tables where once they had no voice. You imagine their diplomats walking into international meetings, heads held high, proving that size does not dictate significance. The country even makes waves by being one of the first to move toward renewable energy initiatives in the Caribbean, exploring geothermal potential on Nevis's volcanic slopes. Yet challenges persist. The economy remains vulnerable to external shocks and hurricanes periodically batter the islands, testing their resilience. In 1989, Hurricane Hugo strikes with devastating force, destroying crops, homes, and infrastructure. You stand in the aftermath, watching neighbors help neighbors rebuilding with whatever materials they can find. The British send aid, as do other nations, but it is the local community that drives recovery. You realize that independence has not erased vulnerability, but it has given the people ownership of their struggles and their triumphs. Through it all, the culture of the islands thrives. Music, festivals, carnival celebrations, and local traditions weave together the African heritage, European influences, and Caribbean creativity that define Saint Kitts and Nevis. You walk through a carnival parade where dancers in vibrant costumes move to the beat of drums, and you can almost feel history itself dancing alongside them, chains replaced by rhythm, sorrow transformed into joy. As the 1990s close, the country stands stronger than it began. The Union remains, though held together by both law and effort. The people continue to navigate their identity, two islands, one nation, always negotiating, always balancing. You watch a sunset from Nevis Peak, the sky painted in fiery orange and purple, and the entire country seems to glow in that light. The twin stars on the flag flutter in the breeze, still side by side, despite the storms they've weathered. The journey from colonial outpost to modern nation has been anything but smooth yet. As you breathe in the tropical night air, you sense that these islands have learned how to survive, how to bend without breaking, and how to chart their own path through history. The 21st century greets Saint Kitts and Nevis with a blend of opportunity and uncertainty. You awaken to the sound of waves breaking gently against the shore, the sea calm as glass, and the islands shimmering beneath the Caribbean sun. The colonial chains are long gone, yet new challenges rise on the horizon: globalization, climate change, and the ever-present question of how a small nation thrives in a big world. You stroll through Basseterre, now a lively port city, where cruise ships dock, regularly spilling out streams of tourists. The streets hum with the chatter of vendors selling crafts, spices and jewelry. Tourism has grown into the backbone of the economy, but you hear locals quietly debate its risks. We can't put all our eggs in one basket, one shopkeeper tells another as they stack souvenirs. It's true, storms, global recessions, even pandemics can disrupt the flow of visitors. The government responds with efforts to diversify, investing in offshore finance, exploring geothermal energy on Nevis, and promoting agriculture in new ways. You see solar panels gleaming on rooftops, a sign of the island's push toward renewable energy, an ironic twist on their history as a place once bound to a single crop. Nevis, still protective of its autonomy, thrives in its own style. The island cultivates an image of quiet luxury, attracting visitors who prefer serene resorts over crowded beaches. Its local government continues to use the powers granted by the Constitution, managing its internal affairs with a measured independence. From time to time, murmurs of secession return, but they're quieter now, softened by decades of cooperation and the understanding that unity has its benefits. Historians still argue whether Nevis will ever make another serious bid to leave, but for now the two islands share a steady, if delicate, partnership. Internationally, Saint Kitts and Nevis makes headlines in unexpected ways. In 2006, the country becomes the first in the world to abolish personal income tax, a bold move aimed at boosting investment. Later, it develops a successful citizenship by investment program, drawing wealthy applicants from across the globe. You overhear conversations about the controversy this stirs. Critics say it sells the nation's identity, while supporters argue it strengthens the economy. The debate is fiery, but the revenue funds schools, roads and healthcare, making the policy hard to dismiss. A quirky anecdote arises from these years. The islands begin attracting celebrities and billionaires who purchase property lured by both beauty and tax advantages. Local residents joke about spotting famous faces at grocery stores, turning what could be a source of resentment into light humor. The islands remain small enough that even the wealthy can't fully hide behind their sunglasses. Nature, however, reminds the islands that independence does not mean invulnerability. Hurricanes continue to batter the region. Storms like George in 1998 and Irma in 2017 leave scars on the landscape. You walk through villages where houses have been rebuilt stronger this time, with hurricane shutters and reinforced walls. The resilience of the people shines brighter than any storm. They rebuild, they adapt, and they do so on their own terms, proving that sovereignty is not just about waving a flag, it's about standing firm when the wind howls. Saint Kitts and Nevis also emerge as an environmental leader in the Caribbean. You trek up the lush slopes of Nevis Peak, where geothermal energy projects promise cleaner power and reduced reliance on imported fuel. The forests hum with life, the air cool and fragrant. Looking out from the summit, you see both islands stretching toward the horizon, green against the endless blue sea, and you feel the same sense of determination that carried their ancestors through centuries of struggle. Today, the islands carry their history not as a burden, but as a source of strength. Festivals burst with color, celebrating African heritage, colonial history, and modern identity all at once. Music drifts through the air, blending calypso, soca, and reggae into rhythms that speak of survival and joy. You wander through a carnival parade where the past and present dance side by side, and you realize that the story of Saint Kitts and Nevis is still being written. Every song, every step, every flag raised adds a new line. As evening settles, you find yourself back in Independence Square. The same trees that shaded enslaved people centuries ago now shelter couples holding hands, children laughing, and elders sharing stories. The square, once a stage for suffering, now pulses with life. The national flag flutters gently in the breeze, its two stars shining under the lamplight. They no longer represent islands under foreign control. They stand for two partners in freedom, holding their place proudly in the world. The night deepens, and the sounds of the islands soften into a lullaby of crickets and distant waves. You take a slow breath, feeling the peace of a nation that has walked through fire and come out stronger. Saint Kitts and Nevis may be small, but it has proven that strength is not measured in size but in spirit. The colonial chains have long since fallen, and in their place stands a people who choose their own path, step by steady step, under the stars of their own flag. The journey you've taken through their history fades gently now like the last light of day over the Caribbean Sea. And as you close your eyes, you hear the islands whisper, not in chains, but in freedom. The night fades, the waves quiet, and the stars overhead soften into the first light of dawn. Your journey through the story of Saint Kitts and Nevis slows to a calm exhale. You picture once more the twin islands' green slopes meeting golden shores, their silhouettes rising from the sea like two guardians of resilience. The centuries of hardship, slavery, wars, and the long shadow of empire feel distant now, replaced by the steady rhythm of a nation that governs itself. The flag you saw rise in 1983 still flutters, catching the same Caribbean breeze that once carried the scent of cane fields, and it reminds you that independence is not a single moment, but a choice renewed every day. The people you've walked beside in this story, farmers, laborers, leaders, and children laughing under the sun, continue to shape their future with quiet strength. Even the lingering tensions between Saint Kitts and Nevis no longer seem like cracks, but rather like seams in a fabric that, though stitched from different pieces, holds together because it chooses to. Challenges remain as they do for any nation, yet these islands face them with a confidence born from having survived worse. So as the night finally fades, let the sound of the waves rock you into calm. Let the warmth of the Caribbean wind brush against your cheek, carrying with it the memory of chains broken, voices heard, and freedom claimed. And as you drift off, know that the story of Saint Kitts and Nevis flows on, carried by the tides of history into a tomorrow all their own.